The challenge, the opportunity to connect. The 1960s, a time of imagination and change, a time of anger and fear. The 1960s, a program called Challenge.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
Looked at our connections, our divisions, through the lens of faith. Nearly 60 years later, during these challenging times, we'll take a new look at our divisions, our connections, in a new program called Challenge 2.0. The term brittle masculinity describes the anxiety, the anger that some men are experiencing in the face of change, their embrace of aggression to reassert their dominance. In last week's edition of Challenge 2.0, we explored how that anxiety, that impulse to aggression, has led to the rise of authoritarian leadership, both in this country and in others. This week, we examine how that response has damaged personal, family, and work relationships, and explore how different responses to those changes, the process of reconciliation, can benefit women and men alike. So we're very happy to welcome our guests today, Will Keepin and Cynthia Bricks, who are co-directors of the Satyana Institute. We're going to be hearing much more about that and their focus, and I think it's fair to say that they are pioneers in the field of gender equity and reconciliation. But first, Cynthia and Will, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure to be here, Jeff.
Yes, thank you for inviting us, Jeff.
Well, as we look back, and we are beginning to emerge from the COVID-19 pandemic and the long periods of lockdowns and shelter-in-place orders, it kept people very close together. Was domestic violence more prevalent between partners or between adults and children during this period? Have you seen some evidence that supports that?
We have, and I'll just start by saying that anytime there's any kind of crisis, that whether it's war or hurricanes or any kind of natural disasters like that, we see these rises in domestic violence and poverty, all of these across the board. President Ramaphosa in South Africa said around the country of South Africa that that his country's dealing with two pandemics, the COVID pandemic, but also the violence against women and girls pandemic. And so that's the second one. And I would say extend that to that's worldwide.
There have been increased reports to police of domestic violent crimes. I have gone up but anywhere between 8% and 50% in different parts of the world. There was one county in China where it tripled. It went up by 300%. So these numbers, also the number of reports, people seeking the help of domestic violence shelters and help centers, those calls have gone up, calls to those centers have gone up typically by 20 to 40% in different areas, and sometimes as much as 70 to 80%.
And there's a thought out there or a belief perhaps that this will increase even more as the lockdown restrictions are lifted, because more people can report in then and go for counseling. Yeah.
And perhaps seek protection by moving elsewhere and seeking separation from a partner too.
Yes.
All of those things, yes.
Yeah. And of course, domestic violence happens across the board. So it's not just to women and girls and children, but men and boys also experience that. And we don't want to leave out all populations that are experiencing that. At the same time, it's much more prevalent. The numbers are higher for women and girls.
Having said that, we know that domestic violence existed long before the COVID lockdown. What does that reveal about the traditional perception of masculinity?
About 1/3 of women and girls are abused or raped in their lifetime worldwide. So that's a very painful statistic. And in terms of traditional socialization of men, I think we're all familiar with it. The movies, the Marlboro Man and the movie archetypes of the sort of solitary man who's in control and doesn't have feelings except for anger when he needs to express anger, is in charge, is strong, and basically has women in subservience to him. That is a traditional kind of archetypal socialization. What we found in our work over the years is that across the cultures we've worked in, there is a very similar conditioning of men. And in this kind of hard way, sometimes it's called tough guys, guys spelled Guise, meaning it's an actual shield that men are conditioned to wear. And it's a very tragic condition because in our work, what's revealed is how much men suffer from this.
As there are efforts to confront and change this living out of this picture of masculinity, we see resistance and obstruction. And we've seen some expressed in popular media, social media, various other settings. Have you seen any that particularly jump out in your memory?
Well, one example that comes to mind was a statement made by Steve Bannon, who made a very interesting remark. He said that the anti-patriarchy movement is going to undo 10,000 years of recorded history. Now, he was putting this out as a lament, whereas we would agree with that statement, but we're applauding it. So there's an interesting difference there, but there is definitely some fear and concern that, that men are going to lose privileges and power that they've had. So that's certainly a concern, but I would say there are, I think, in our experience, a larger number of men who actually welcome this change and are actually looking for a transformation of the traditional masculinity socialization. So there's a lot of men who are welcoming this and supporting it. So, there's both of those currents out there.
One thing I just add, Jeff, is that for me personally, we hear a lot about toxic masculinity. And I really try to change that language, not to deny that isn't there, but the vast majority of men, people who identify as men, are not toxic. And that's really important. The vast majority of men do not go out and violate and rape women. But there's this huge emphasis on it because it is so prevalent by a small number that are repeat offenders. And it doesn't mean all of us on some level, well, first are walking around with a level of trauma because reading the news of what's happening with climate change and the COVID virus and poverty and all of this and Black Lives Matters, people on the street fighting to change the system that's oppressing us all of that can be traumatic at different levels. And then we have our own home lives or our own intimate relationships where things can be challenging. So all of us are dealing with it. All of us also have, as the Vietnamese Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh says, I am every part of this. And so part of my spiritual life is trying to always be the more perfect person, be the more in this human condition that we all live in. How can I aspire to be kinder? How can I aspire to be more healthy in all my actions? And so in turning that around and not thinking so much as it being toxic, not denying it because we need to be accountable to that and address it, but also to address it in a healthy way and say healthy masculinity, healthy femininity. And where do we take that?
The vast majority of men are not toxic in the usual way that we understand this. What happens is that a small percentage of men create a kind of a threatening environment by which all men are tainted. A good example is rapes on university campuses, which was a pretty significant issue recently, as you may recall. And statistics show that about 90% of the rapes committed on campus are committed by 3% of the men. So what you have is a small percentage of men who are repeat offenders, who are basically responsible for a large proportion of the suffering. Similarly, with some of what was revealed in the Me Too movement, some of the offenders who were repeat offenders with multiple women that they were basically exploiting and harassing. So I think it's important to recognize that the majority of men are not actively engaged in such activities. And what we've discovered in our work is the majority of men actually want and love the possibility of establishing a reconciliation and a mutuality and a harmony with women on an equal playing field.
Paint for us, if you would, a picture of traditional masculinity, how your view differs, and how that can be profoundly empowering both for men and for women.
You know, traditional masculinity fits into what is sometimes called the man box,
Mhm.
which is a set of guidelines for how men are supposed to be. You know, don't cry, be strong, be tough, be in control, don't show vulnerability, don't show weakness. And so what happens is that men are boxed in, literally. And if they step out of that box, they are kept, their peers will hurl insults at them to kind of
Mm.
keep them contained. That's kind of a simplistic but accurate in many ways model of traditional male socialization. What we find in our work is that, you know, bottom line, men and women are both human beings, and they're far more alike than they are different. Once we get to the interiority, I would say, apart from a very small minority of men, our work over 29 years in 12 countries shows that the vast majority of men actually yearn for this relationship of mutual respect and harmony with women. And they want that collaborative, constructive, healthy kind of relating. And they flower when it's modeled for them and supported.
And I just want to add a couple things. One is that when women come to our work and work with the men, they're often quite surprised to hear the level of violence and oppression that's happened to men when they were boys, or even in current times in their manhood. And from, you know, domestic violence, as we were talking about, or partner abuse, or things like this. And it's because men are in that box often and trained to not talk about it, to oppress it, man up, don't cry, these sorts of things. And so that's a real aha for women to say, wow. And with that, it creates a bridge to say, wow, we're in this together. It doesn't say it's equal in the sense of, you know, the violence against girls and women, because the things we talked about in the beginning, the natural disasters, the wars, these sorts of things oppress the lowest denominator on the human scale, I guess.
Tell us a little bit about how you work with men and women in your groups, in your programs, and what it is you do and what it is you're seeking to achieve with them.
So we're creating beloved community as we go through. We have a very experiential process that is now online, as well as in person, a 3-day process initially, where we start out to really create a safe forum. Safety is in the forefront of all our programs. And then we deepen in, and we start speaking truth to our experience. Again, with the intention for healing, with the intention for a safer space. And then by the end of that, we go deep into that process, into that truth telling and the experiences that we all have. And then we don't dwell there. We say, okay, we needed to do that. We needed to witness and listen to each other and really hear, and sometimes be accountable for it and apologize and find forgiveness. But then we need to come back out, and we need to celebrate and honor. That's the main thing, the honoring of one another for showing up and speaking truth to our experience.
So it's a flow, and the kind of beginning place of our work is to create safety. Then the second part of the work is really based on the principle that untold stories keep oppression invisible. And so we need a space where the truth of our stories can come forward. And most of the institutions of society in different ways are complicit one way or another in keeping those stories untold. And in particular, with the stories of exploitation and harassment, You can see that from the non-disclosure agreements that organizations, institutions, and corporations will go to vast lengths to prevent these stories from ever coming out. Well, what we do is we bring these stories forward, and then we move through the pain and challenge that that brings up. But it doesn't get mired in sort of sorrow and wailing. What is so remarkable, and this is what is so important to understand, is that the human spirit is stronger than any of these violations. And what happens is that we move through that pain and challenge together.
Oftentimes, people have trepidation stepping into our work.
Mhm.
And I mean, we're sitting here talking right now, and it's okay. But when we actually are invited to come in and share at a deeper level about some of the challenge, it gets a little scary, both to speak that, but also men in general, maybe across, not always, but sometimes and often might worry about male bashing,
Yeah.
from the women. And so what's going to happen here? Is it going to be safe enough for me to show up? There's a story from our course that a woman showed up. I renamed her Dolores, and she came to the first workshop, and she was so excited to be there. Within the first half the day, she started opening up, and she started slowly bringing her story out. And her story was one of pretty severe abuse.
Mhm.
She lived in a marriage that her husband would beat the children, beat her. At sometimes he would even dangle the babies over the balcony, threatening to drop them. At one point, he said he wanted to move. He moved his mistress into the household and made the mother and the children all go and live in the toilet area. That's where they slept and everything. This went on for years. So Dolores was in our program, and she started sharing about it. She had a lot of joy.
Mhm.
And she had never shared this story before. So her life was joyous because she wasn't in that situation. She didn't live with him anymore. She was out of it, but she had never shared this story before.
Mhm.
And she started opening up, and the men there were present and listened. That was the healing. The women were present and listened and held her in that space. At the end of the time together, we honor each other. And so the men created a ceremony to honor the women, and the women do the same in our course. And so the men created, they had us all outside the room, and they led us in during the ceremony. There was soft music playing, and they set us in a semicircle looking at them, and they had this structure of chairs, one on top of another, like, folding chairs. And it was this big tower. And then there were two men on each side, and they said, "We are here to commit to breaking down and dismantling the patriarchy and these systems that oppress us all." And they, at that point, took the lower legs of the chairs and pulled them, and the whole tower came crashing down. And the women just, exclaimed, and there was just silence. But just the dramatic force of that was so powerful. And then they came with water, and a bowl of water and a towel, and they one by one invited us to put our hands in the water,
Mhm.
and then invited the soft touch to dry the hands and a little massage. This, for Dolores and several people there, several of the women, they had never felt the safe touch of a man before.
That's a fascinating and troubling story all at the same time. But have you had a chance to track that and see how that changed her situation farther down the line?
Dolores, we saw her a while later, and she came running up to us, and she said, "Will and Cynthia, I have to share what happened after the workshop. I went to my husband's grave, and he died about 20 years ago. And when I arrived, I was able to sit at his grave and forgive him for everything that had happened. And then I knew where his mistress lived. And I went to her house, and I knocked on her door, and she answered, and she was in a wheelchair. And she
Mm.
said, 'Dolores, I've been thinking about you, And she invited her in.
A whole week. She said,
Yeah,
"It's
all
so
week
good."
or whenever, however long it had been from the workshop.
Mhm.
She invited her in and said, I think I'm in this wheelchair and I'm having all these issues with my health because of all the things that I did to hurt you and your children.
Mhm.
And so they were able to talk and reconcile and forgive one another for all that had happened. So that's the beauty of this work, is the full picture, the full spectrum of 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 bringing truth forward and what can happen in the meantime if we enter in with that healing intention.
Do you also have a story of a male who showed considerable transformation or change in his life? And if so, could you share that with us?
Oh yeah, we have several. One is coming to mind of a man in his mid-20s who, in one of our workshops, and our workshops get pretty intense at times with the power of the stories that come forward. And there was a woman who told her story of having been raped, brutally raped, and she was actually doing our work, preparing to face her rapist in court. And so she
Mm.
came to a couple of our programs, and she told the story, um, not so much as a victim, but just as a witness, just speaking to what it's actually like and what she went through. And it was spellbinding. And it's a story that most people don't hear, but I guarantee you, not one man in that room had ever heard a story like that. And
Yeah.
afterwards, there was this long silence, and this young man said, "I don't know how to be a man anymore. I
Mm.
feel traumatized." And we worked with him and we helped him to understand that the reason he was feeling traumatized was because he had heard this story with his heart and he had taken into
Mhm.
his own heart some of this woman's pain. He was now feeling that pain within him. And that's a crucial turning point in our work, is when we experience the pain of the other as our own pain, then there's a bridge across our hearts and we're both transformed by that shared experience of
Mhm.
suffering. That's compassion, suffering with. So that's what happened to this man. And we worked with him, helped him to understand. Well, it turned out that became a major turning point in his life. About a year after that, he actually signed up for our and our reconciliation facilitator training. That's a year-long program. He did that whole training, and then he became one of our facilitators. So he is now a man who basically does this same healing work with other
Mm.
groups of men and women.
There was one man that came to our program and listened to the women's story, listened to the men's story, and he was very moved, very touched. And then he went home and he said to his wife, I heard these deep stories this weekend. I am so glad that none of that has happened to you. And they hadn't been married for, 30 or 40 years. And she looked at him and said, "What do you mean? That happened to me. We just never talked about it." You've never asked. So that's a piece of just having the conversations and asking your partners and your family members, "Hey, what's going on in your life this way?"
Yeah.
And I'll just add that the men come and often first of all, the violence, male to male violence, is actually higher.
It's about 3 times higher than
Then-
male to female
Really?
violence.
And that's really important to know. And also, male suicide with men is higher.
4 times as high as women committing suicide.
And so, but yet the conditioning we have is for men to not speak about these things. And that's
Right.
part of the problem, part of the issue, right? With health concerns and things like this. So, but when men come to the work and start sharing things around bullying, in
Mhm.
school, or even competition, that how they show up that way, domestic violence, abuse of parents in childhood, so family a lineage kind of abuse,
Mhm.
intimate partner abuse that starts coming out, even rape that happened with men, and sexual harassment that happens can sometimes come out.
For those of our viewers that are watching out there or listeners Are there a couple of key points that you could maybe offer them that might be at least points of departure in their own lives if they're not able, at least at this time, to participate in a program like that? What would you suggest they do?
Like I was saying earlier, being kind to one another,
Mhm.
listening, taking a witnessing perspective and just observing what's going on and finding that safe place that you person or center, counseling center, or wherever, to find the safe place that you can speak some of what's going on in your life.
Mhm.
And if you're in an abusive situation, then to find ways to get out.
Well, there is so much more that we could talk about, and I hope we can come back together and talk about this. Where we start to see some progress, and where we need to go, perhaps with our children. That might be another area of fruitful discussion. But I thank you both so much. The clock is implacable, and to all of our viewers and listeners, thank you for joining us on this week's edition of Challenge 2.0. We hope you'll tune in again next week. If you've enjoyed this program, found our conversations to be informative, entertaining, and thought-provoking, and the vision inspiring of people from different backgrounds who can disagree without being disagreeable, perhaps you might consider supporting our program with a contribution. Your support will not only help our program continue, it will also support the broader efforts of Paths to Understanding, our supporting parent nonprofit organization.